There's a specific kind of girl who falls in love for the first time and doesn't even realize it's happening while it's happening. She has nothing to compare it to, so the feeling doesn't announce itself as rare or dangerous or once in a lifetime. It just shows up one day, the way seasons do, quiet and uninvited, and by the time she notices it, she's already standing inside it. I was that girl, and I was 22. I want to say something honest about who I was at 22 before I say anything else, because the story doesn't hold together without that honesty. I was the kind of person who made herself useful and invisible at the same time. I was good at listening. I asked the right questions. I made people feel seen without ever really standing in the middle of a room myself. I had goals, I had friends who genuinely loved me, and I had this quiet, stubborn feeling that I was always just a little bit on the outside of things, watching from somewhere adjacent to where everything was happening, never quite walking all the way in. I had never been in love. I had been infatuated, the way teenage girls get infatuated, that hot and embarrassing thing where you replay a 30-second conversation in your head 17 times before you fall asleep. But that was not love. Even at the time, somewhere beneath the mortification, I knew it wasn't. What I had never had, what I couldn't even fully imagine, was the thing that comes after the infatuation, the thing that settles into your body and makes itself at home without asking. I had never been chosen slowly. Never had someone look at me like I was worth staying for. And then I met him. I'll call him Leo. His real name belongs to a version of my life that is still tender in certain places, and I'm not ready to hand it over. He was 24. He had this quality about him that I noticed within the first hour of knowing him, this way of making whoever he was talking to feel like the only conversation happening anywhere on earth. Not in a performative way. Not in the way of someone who had practiced it. He was just genuinely, almost hungrily, interested in people. In the real answers, not the polite ones. I met him at a mutual friends thing, a loose gathering in a small apartment on a Friday night, music playing just low enough to talk over. I was in the kitchen refilling my drink and he was standing at the counter eating crackers like he owned the place, and he asked what I was studying. I told him, expecting the usual nod before the subject changed. Instead, he asked why I'd chosen it, then what I loved about it. Then, very casually, whether I was afraid I'd chosen wrong. Nobody had asked me that. I had asked myself that, alone at 2 in the morning more times than I could count. But nobody had ever thought to ask out loud, had never thought I'd want to say it to another person. We talked for 2 hours after that. Not the giddy overlapping kind of talking where two people are performing excitement at each other. The slow kind. The kind with pauses neither of us rushed to fill. When I left and walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat, I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there for a minute. And I thought, very simply, not dramatically at all, something just happened. He texted me 2 days later. Not immediately, not in a way that felt like a game either. Just 2 days later, like he had been thinking about it and decided, quietly, that he wanted to keep going. That 2-day pause meant more to me than urgency would have. I had been chased before, and the chasing had always felt like it was about the boy doing it, not about me. But this felt like consideration. It felt like I was worth thinking about before acting on. Our first date was a walk. Not dinner, not a movie. A 3-hour walk through a neighborhood neither of us lived in, with coffee from a place he knew. We walked until my feet ached and I forgot to care. Somewhere around the second hour, he reached over and took my hand. No announcement, no moment made of it, just reached over and took it like it was something we had already been doing. My whole chest tightened. I kept my face very calm. Inside, something small and irreversible was happening. The first month was the kind of month that should probably be illegal, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it was so quietly good that it started changing things in me I hadn't realized could change. I did not understand, before him, that I had been living slightly contracted, taking up less space than I needed. There are things about yourself you cannot see until someone holds up the right mirror. Leo was the first person who showed me a version of myself I had not yet fully met, and she was better than I expected. He was interested in me specifically, not in me as a concept, not as someone to be with. In me, the particular person with the particular opinions and the specific laugh and the habit of going very quiet when I was thinking hard about something. He noticed the quiet. He didn't reach in to fill it. He just waited, and when I came back from wherever I'd gone, he was still there. That first month I learned I was funnier than I thought I was. Not performing humor, actually funny, dry and sideways and quick, and he was the first person who caught it consistently, who laughed at the things I said under my breath, who heard the small jokes I had almost stopped bothering to make because most people talked right over them. Every time he laughed at one of those, something in me unclenched. I also learned slowly that he was carrying weight. I noticed it around the second month. Small things at first, a hesitation before certain questions, a careful way of steering away from his family, his past, the years before I knew him. I noticed and I waited the way he waited for me, and gradually, over weeks and months, pieces came. His childhood had not been easy. I won't say more than that because the specifics are his. What I can say is that he had grown up in an environment where love was conditional in ways that shifted without warning, where emotional steadiness was not something he had been shown. He had learned, young, to manage himself carefully, to read rooms, to stay competent and functional and not need too much from anyone. He was working on it. He told me this directly, and I believed him because I could see the evidence of the work in the way he talked about himself. In the self-awareness he had that a lot of people his age simply didn't. He could name what was happening inside him. He just couldn't always act from that naming. The knowing and the doing were not yet the same thing, and there was a gap between them that would matter later, though I didn't understand that yet. Then, I just heard a young man who was honest about trying, and that honesty struck me as something close to courage. I want to be fair to 22-year-old me here. She was not naive. She was not swallowing red flags in a cloud of infatuation. She was genuinely falling for a genuinely good person who had real struggles, and she made a real choice to love him alongside those struggles. That is not stupidity. That is what love actually does when it's real. The problem wasn't that she was foolish. The problem was that she had never done this before, and she didn't yet understand how much of a relationship's weight eventually comes to rest on the person who is more ready. But that understanding was still far off. For a long time, things were good. I mean that plainly and without revision. They were good. Genuinely, substantively good, and I owe it to the truth not to rewrite that into something smaller or more cautionary in hindsight. It was good, and I was happy, and both things were real. He taught me to cook 3 things. I introduced him to a period of art history he had no reason to have encountered before and watched his face change as he started to find it interesting. We had a restaurant we went to on the 3rd Saturday of every month, a small place with bad overhead lighting and extraordinary food, where the waiter eventually stopped handing us menus and just brought what we always ordered. We had a blanket we kept in the back of his car for spontaneous drives to nowhere in particular, to some hill or field where we'd lie down and look at whatever sky we found. We had a private language built from months of small references and repeated jokes that would mean nothing to anyone else and meant everything to us. He was good to me in the ways that are easy to overlook when you're telling a breakup story later. He showed up. He remembered things. He remembered my friends' names and the details of their lives and asked after them like he meant it. When I was sick, he brought food without being asked. When I was anxious, and anxiety was something I had always managed privately, kept behind a door, he was the first person outside my tightest circle I let see it fully. The first time I told him I was spiraling, really spiraling, he didn't try to fix it or talk me out of it. He just sat down next to me and said he was glad I told him. That was all. And that was more than most people had ever given me. I learned what it felt like to be held, and I don't just mean physically, though I mean that too. I mean the larger feeling, the feeling of existing inside something that functions like arms around you, like warmth you didn't know you were missing until you had it. I had thought I was fine before him. Baseline fine, indoor temperature, nothing wrong. And then there was this, and I understood that I had been cold for years without having a word for it. I learned what it felt like to be seen as feminine in the real sense, not the decorative kind, not the performed kind. In the sense that someone valued the specific way I moved through the world, the way I cared for things, the particular texture of how I loved. He thought I was beautiful on the days I was impatient, on the days I was scared, on the days I was too tired to be charming or composed. And when a person who has no obligation to find you wonderful finds you wonderful anyway, something shifts in you that doesn't shift back. I became more myself with him. I don't know a more honest way to say it. The girl who stood slightly outside of things started opening doors, started speaking first in rooms, started wearing what she actually wanted to wear instead of what would make her easiest to overlook. She started taking up space she had always suspected she wasn't quite allowed. He gave me that, and I want to name it clearly, even knowing what comes next. He gave me that, and it was real, and it stays with me. I carry it now. But there was the gap. The gap between what he understood about himself and what he could do with that understanding. It wasn't always obvious. There were long stretches where it seemed like it was closing, where whatever he needed to heal was actually healing. And then something would happen, sometimes a big thing, often something small and ordinary, and the gap would open again, and I would feel the draft coming through it. When he was stressed, he went away, not physically. He was still present, still there, but some essential part of him retreated behind a door and closed it quietly, and there was no getting in. I learned to give him room. I learned to wait. And for a long time, that felt like maturity, like the right thing, like I was being the kind of partner you're supposed to be. But patience that is never acknowledged turns into something lonelier over time. It calcifies. There were moments when I needed him available and he wasn't. Not because he was cruel, not because he didn't love me, but because when his own internal weather went dark, he had nothing left over for whatever was happening in me. He would be kind on the surface and gone underneath, and I learned to read that surface kindness as a sign, a soft warning that this was not the time, that I should find somewhere else to put what I was carrying. The problem is that the somewhere else adds up. You put one thing there, and then another, and eventually you have a whole room full of things you haven't said and needs you haven't named, and you're managing that room alone, in the middle of a relationship that was supposed to mean you didn't have to. I didn't resent him. I want to be precise about this because resentment isn't quite the right word. What I felt was closer to a grief that arrived slowly and without a clear event attached to it. Nobody died. Nothing broke in any obvious way. We were still together. We still had the restaurant and the blanket and the private language. But something was shifting underneath all of it, and I could feel it the way you can feel a season about to turn before the temperature has actually dropped. Around the year-and-a-half mark, I started noticing the weight of it. I noticed I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. I noticed certain conversations kept not happening, not because we agreed to avoid them, but because the timing always seemed wrong, he always seemed not quite in the right place, and I kept waiting a little longer. I noticed I was doing a kind of work inside the relationship that had become invisible to me. The calibrating, the room reading, the constant quiet calculation of when to surface things and when to let them sink. And I noticed something harder than all of that. I noticed I was starting to shrink again, not all the way, not back to who I was before him, but the version of me who had been opening doors was getting quieter. The space I had started taking up was getting slightly smaller. I was folding myself in small ways to fit inside the shape of what we were. And the shape of what we were had been built, I started to understand, more around his comfort than mine. I don't think he knew this. I want to say that clearly and mean it. He wasn't doing it deliberately. He was doing his best with what he had, and what he had was not enough yet, not because he was a bad person, but because he hadn't finished the work, and the work had no clear finish line, and some of the cost of that was landing on me without either of us seeing it clearly. The question that a relationship eventually has to face is whether you can survive the distance between where someone is and where they need to be. The conversation happened on a Tuesday. I remember the specific dullness of it. Nothing about a Tuesday prepares you for anything. It doesn't carry the dramatic weight of a Friday night or the clean finality of a Sunday. It was a Tuesday afternoon in what was technically spring but still felt like the end of winter. I had come over after work. We were having what felt like a normal evening, and then without transition, we weren't. I don't think either of us planned for it to happen that day. But I think we had both been carrying it long enough that it was ready to happen, and Tuesday afternoon was when it finally slid off the shelf. He said he needed space. He said, and he was honest about this, painfully and commendably honest, that he wasn't able to be the partner I deserved right now. He said he knew there were things in him that were unresolved, things that kept pulling him away from me in the moments I needed him present, and that he didn't know when that would change, and that it wasn't fair to keep asking me to wait for a version of himself he couldn't promise was coming. He said he loved me. He said it looking directly at me, and I could see that he meant it, and that was the part that broke something I hadn't realized could break. It would have been simpler in some ways if love had just faded, if it had gone stale or grown distant in the ordinary way things do, but it hadn't. It was still there. We both knew it was still there, and we were ending it anyway. He was choosing to leave not because I wasn't enough, but because he knew, honestly knew, that he wasn't, not yet. And he loved me enough to understand that wasn't fair. That is the particular kind of wound that doesn't close quickly. I drove home. I remember the drive with unusual clarity, the specific quality of the light that afternoon, yellow and thin and low, the particular way it fell across everything. I parked and sat in my car for a long time. The same way I had sat in my car the night we met, except that this was the opposite of that night. That night the sitting had been full, so full I needed a moment before I could move. This was the opposite of full. This was the emptiest I had ever felt. It was as if the entire interior of me had gone very, very quiet. I went inside, made tea I didn't drink, sat on the couch. Didn't cry for the first 20 minutes, which confused me. I had expected immediate crying. Instead, there was just stillness and an awareness of how much space was around me that had not been there before, like the room had gotten larger. Then I cried, the kind that doesn't feel like crying so much as something tearing open. Not dramatic or gasping, just steady and unstoppable, coming from somewhere deeper than whatever I thought I was sad about. Because I was not only crying about him, though I was crying about him. I was crying about all of it, the restaurant, the blanket, the walk, the way he said my name, the version of myself I had been with him, and whether she would stay now that he was gone. I was 22 years old and I had just lost my first love, and I had nothing to tell me I would survive it, because I had never survived it before. The weeks after that were the kind you live through without being fully inside. I went to work. I saw my friends. I ate most of the time. I slept badly and then better and then badly again. There is nothing cinematic about grief from the inside. It is mostly just the grinding, unglamorous work of getting through days that keep arriving whether you want them to or not. My friends were good to me. They showed up with food and wine, and with the patience to let me talk in circles, and they had the grace to not say he wasn't worth it, because the good ones know that bypasses the point entirely. He was worth it. That was the thing I kept running into. He had been worth loving. The relationship had been worth having. The ending was not evidence that I had been wrong. The ending was just an ending, two people who loved each other in a season where love wasn't quite sufficient on its own, and neither of them the villain of it. I kept waiting for a turning point. The movie kind, the morning where you wake up and something has shifted and you can see the horizon again. That is not what happened. What happened was just slightly better days accumulating slowly until I looked back one afternoon and realized that a month ago had been harder, and the month before that harder still. The sometimes was a long time coming. What I thought about in those months was not always painful. Some of it was him, the plain missing of a specific person, which is different from loneliness. But some of what I thought about was what the relationship had shown me about myself. The things I'd learned about who I was by being loved in that specific way. I thought about how I had been funny and he had caught it. I thought about telling him about my anxiety out loud and the world not ending. I thought about the version of me who had started opening doors, and I thought hard about whether she had needed him to exist or whether she had always been there, just waiting for someone to make it safe enough to come out. I decided she had always been in there. He had helped her out, but she was mine. The love he had given me was something I had allowed myself to receive, and that allowing was something I had done. That was mine too, and learning doesn't unhappen when the person who occasioned it leaves. Something happens to a woman who has been loved well, even briefly, even imperfectly. Something settles in her that is difficult to undo. She knows now that she is capable of being truly seen. She knows that the things she worried were too much, the quiet, the particular humor, the anxiety, the need for depth and realness were not too much. They were what someone once chose. And once you know that, you cannot unknow it. It is not returnable. I started taking up space differently after he left. Not right away. Grief contracts you first, pulls you in. But then, slowly, I noticed myself doing things I wouldn't have done before him. Saying things out loud that I would have kept in my head. Being more honest with people about what I was actually feeling. Making choices based on what I wanted rather than what would cause the smallest disturbance. I started dressing for myself. I know that sounds small. I don't think it's small. When someone has made you feel beautiful in the real sense, in the sense that says you are beautiful in your specific particularity and not as a generic pleasant object, it changes your relationship to yourself in a way that is hard to explain and very hard to reverse. It stops being fraught. It becomes more yours. I kept cooking the 3 things he had taught me, and then I learned others. Cooking had always felt intimidating before him, and he had made it feel low stakes and unhurried, and that quality survived him leaving. I started asking people why they chose the things they'd chosen, following up past the polite answers to get to the real ones. That was something I had caught from him directly, that specific kind of curiosity that waits for the actual response. I had been standing close to it long enough to carry it myself. There is a version of this story that ends with me understanding that we were simply wrong for each other, that the love wasn't real, that he was a chapter I needed to close to get to the right one. I don't believe that version. I think we were not wrong for each other so much as we were wrong for the specific time we were trying to be together in. I think the love was real. Real love can end without becoming retroactively false. What ended us was not incompatibility of character. It was incompatibility of readiness. He needed more time inside himself, more time to close the gap between what he understood and what he could do. The work was real. It just wasn't done. And I was inside the process with him, absorbing some of the cost of it, and had been absorbing it for long enough that I had stopped noticing how much. I believe, and this belief is not sentimental, it's based on what I saw in him, that he would have been different in a year or 2. I believe the man he was becoming was worth knowing. But I was 22 and I was also becoming something, and I could not put myself in stasis while he completed a process with no clear finish line. That is the cruelty of loving someone who is still in the middle of their own repair. You can see who they are going to be. You are already in love with that person. And you cannot make them arrive faster, and you cannot always afford to wait, and there is no villain in this, only timing, which is indifferent to what people deserve. I saw him once about a year later at another gathering in a small apartment, same kind of loose Friday night crowd. He was across the room. He seemed lighter. He smiled at me, and it was a real smile, nothing complicated in it, just recognition and a kind of leftover warmth that had survived the ending. I smiled back. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. I don't know if he is someone's person now. I hope he is. I hope the work finished, or finished enough. I hope whoever came after me got the version of him that was ready. I hope she knows, without knowing why, that she is standing in something that took him a long time and some real courage to build. I am not her, and I am at peace with that now, more peace than I would have predicted. Being first means being part of the building. It means being there before the walls are up. It means loving someone in the middle of their becoming and being changed by their becoming, and then going on to become separately. There is something that is hard about that. There is also, in its strange way, something that is an honor. I am 25 now, telling you this. 3 years is not very long in the arc of a life, but it is long enough to understand some things you couldn't see at 22. The first thing is this: your first love teaches you what love is supposed to feel like. Not perfect love. Not the love of a person with no wounds or no gaps, but the substance of it, the choosing and the seeing and the staying. And once you know what the real thing feels like, you can't be satisfied with the imitation. You recognize the imitation now. That is a gift, even when it makes everything harder. The second thing is this: what you learn about yourself inside a real love does not belong to the love. It belongs to you. The woman who started opening doors was already in there. The love was the light that made her visible. She is still here. She kept going through doors after the person who first opened them was gone. The third thing is this, and it is the hardest one. It is possible to love someone and not be able to stay. It is possible for love to be entirely real and still not be sufficient. This is not comfortable knowledge. It is easier to believe that real love always finds a way, that endings mean something was lacking. But sometimes the ending is just the ending. The love was still love. Both things are true, neither erases the other. I think about the girl in that kitchen, holding her drink, being asked for the real answer. I think about how she had no idea what was starting. How she gave herself over to it, not recklessly, but fully, which is the only honest way to do it. She got hurt. She got hurt in the specific, enormous way of a first heartbreak, and she survived it, and she came out different, and she came out more. That is the thing about first love that nobody tells you before it happens, because it would be impossible to believe before it happens. It makes you more of yourself, even after it ends, especially after it ends, because the loss asks something of you. It asks you to carry the tenderness it opened in you and find somewhere to put it that doesn't require him to still be present. That is the work that comes after. And it is real work, slow and unglamorous and not linear. But it is yours. I think about the restaurant with the bad lighting. I feel something that is not quite sadness and not quite warmth, some precise combination of both that I don't have a name for. I think about the 3-hour walk and the hand I wasn't expecting. I think about how I learned, inside that love, that I was someone worth knowing, worth choosing, worth staying for. That knowledge did not leave with him. It has followed me into every room I've walked into since. Into new friendships and new mornings, and the slow, continuing work of figuring out what I want from this life, and having the nerve to actually want it. Into the way I treat myself on the hard days, with more patience than I would have managed before him, because he was patient with me on my hard days, and I learned from the example. He did not save me, I want to be clear about that. I don't believe in being saved by another person, and this is not that story. But he showed me something, a version of love that was careful and specific and real, and seeing it was enough to make it a standard I carry now. Not a checklist, not a template, a feeling. The feeling of what it is like to be truly seen, to be held in the larger sense, to exist inside something that respects the difficult, particular, specific person you actually are. I will not settle for less than that. Not because I am waiting for him or searching for someone like him, but because knowing what that feeling is makes anything less impossible to mistake for it. I am grateful that the first person who loved me well enough for that. And I am grateful that he let me go when he understood he couldn't give me what I needed yet. That was the last real thing he did for me, and it was not a small thing. He chose honesty over the comfort of keeping things the way they were. He chose it even when it cost him. That is not nothing. In some ways, that was the most love he ever showed me. And I am here, still becoming, still walking through doors, still asking for the real answer. Still the woman who learned, on a 3-hour walk she never saw coming, that she was worth taking the long way for. If something in this story felt familiar, if it touched a place you don't often put into words, I'd love to hear what stayed with you. You can share it in the comments, quietly, in your own way. And if you want more stories like this, the kind that sit with you and gently help you return to yourself, you can subscribe and stay close.